Nadine Strossen is joining me today. She's the former president of the ACLU and is the author of Hate. Nadine, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Samantha.
Now, I just want to dive right in. This recent New York Times article talks about a potential identity crisis with the ACLU. The title is Once a Bastion of Free Speech, the ACLU Faces an Identity Crisis. Now, when you log on to the ACLU website, it states that the ACLU dares to create a more perfect union beyond one person, party, or side. Our mission is to realize this promise of the United States Constitution for all and expand the reach of its guarantees. Now, based on this report from the New York Times, do you think the ACLU has strayed from that mission? Do you think that it sort of casts a dark shadow over the ACLU?
Absolutely not, Samantha. And I should clarify that I'm not relying on the New York Times account. I am intimately familiar with the ACLU's ongoing work, which is vast, at not only at the national level in courts, in legislatures, but also all across the country through our nationwide network of what we call state-based affiliates. And within each state, there are chapters. So there's a tremendous amount of work being done. I follow it, and I especially follow work about freedom of speech as well as racial justice, because for the past half dozen or so years, those have been my big passions, especially to show the essential interconnectedness between those two goals. And from the ACLU's beginning, way back in almost more than a century, we had our 100th birthday last year, we have from the beginning been committed to defending, as you said, our website still says, all fundamental freedoms for all people. There are some organizations that fight only for particular rights, including free speech rights, free press rights, due process rights, religious freedom, and so forth. There are other organizations that fight for the rights of particular groups of people, racial justice groups, religious groups, women's rights groups. But I think it is essential that we have an organization such as the ACLU, which tries to our very best ability to do what the US government and state governments are obligated to do, and that is to protect every right for everyone, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, and not to privilege certain rights over others or the rights of certain groups of people over others. I can tell you, Samantha, throughout the ACLU's history, there have been what I consider to be healthy debates, both within the organization and outside the organization, about how do you accommodate multiple rights, and some rights may be in tension with other rights, and the assertions of one group of people for their rights may be at odds with assertions by other people. So in a microcosm, the debate about the ACLU is really the debate about our nationwide priorities. We're aspiring to liberty and justice for all, right? And we're having major debates right now about the relationship between racial justice and free speech. And I adamantly support both, as does the ACLU. And I know a lot of people disagree with me on this from different perspectives, but I believe we cannot have meaningful freedom of speech without robust equality. And we cannot achieve robust equality without extremely strong freedom of speech.
Well, it's so interesting that we're having this conversation to begin with, because while you were president, from 1991 through 2008, you had actually written something similar to what we're talking about almost 30 years later. I just want to reference that this was back in 1994. Lately, however, disagreements about the fundamental nature of the ACLU's mandate and its proper role have occupied the media spotlight. The criticism essentially charges that the ACLU is abandoning its traditional commitment to free speech and other classic civil liberties, and is becoming a, quote, trendy liberal organization primarily concerned with equality and civil rights. Now, just to fast forward to today, in this New York Times article, Ira Glasser, who is on the advisory board with you at FIRE, talks about how there's only one ACLU that is a content neutral defender of speech, of free speech, and he fears that we're in danger of losing that. What do you think of his comments? And is there any backing to support what he's saying?
I agree with the first part of Ira Glasser's comment that there is only one ACLU, which is committed to defending all freedoms for everyone. That was the point I myself made earlier. So we are in agreement on that point, but we are in very strong disagreement as to whether the ACLU is backsliding from part of its priorities. And I want to point out, Samantha, that way back in the early 90s, when I wrote that article, it was based on a speech I gave a year earlier in 1993. Ira Glasser was the ACLU's national executive director. And under his leadership, the exact same charges were being made. Ira, to his credit, was very active in making sure the ACLU had a prominent role in fighting for racial justice, for gender justice, for reproductive justice, for LGBTQ rights, etc. And he was then criticized for taking the ACLU away from the allegedly classic commitment to free speech. But again, I want to say that I am so proud that from the beginning, way back in 1920, the ACLU was one of the few then predominantly white organizations that was working hand in glove with the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was slightly older than the ACLU, in the long campaign against Jim Crow and for racial justice. And we had members of the NAACP board were on the ACLU board and vice versa. So, and I also want to point out, Samantha, that just a few days ago, I did a debate on National Public Radio in New York after the New York Times article had come out, where a young African-American lawyer and journalist, Ellie Mastel, was arguing that the ACLU is still doing too much to defend free speech for white supremacists and conservatives. So we are getting the criticism from both sides. Some think that we should tone down our work on racial and other forms of social justice. Others think that we should tone down our work on free speech. And I continue to maintain that we should do both. But I certainly welcome, and I should also add that I don't think we can effectively do one without doing the other. I don't think there is such a thing as meaningful free speech in our society if there are certain people who belong to certain groups whose voices are silenced because they are deprived of equal access to educational and technological and other resources that are necessary to effectively participate in the debate. Conversely, we cannot effectively advocate for racial or gender or other forms of social justice unless we have the most vigorous form of free speech that extends even to speech that other people consider to be hateful. Right now, the ACLU, for example, is defending a leader of Black Lives Matter, DeRay McKesson. He and other such leaders have been accused of engaging in hate speech and terrorist speech. So again, these rights are mutually reinforcing.
I'm actually glad that you brought up that interview that you recently did, because I did listen to it. It was so interesting to hear, both sides of it. Obviously, this New York Times article was essentially arguing the opposite. And then, like you mentioned, the guest, Ellie, Ellie was, saying the opposite of what the New York Times article was saying. So I thought that was super interesting to watch. And something that I didn't realize, that back in 2017 with the Charlottesville incident, the ACLU actually defended this far right group that, ended up, obviously, they had the parade and ended up turning into violence. One woman died, and then other, people that were there were injured. So I didn't know that, actually, until I read this article. And, maybe that's my own fault for not, being aware. But in this article, it points out a couple of different examples of how, the ACLU was being framed as, this anti-Trump resistance, and how it had, fundraised millions of dollars after his election. So where do you see the organization moving forward, where you have sort of the argument on both sides, like you pointed out with that interview, but also with this article?
One of the points that I really loved in the New York Times article was when the journalist asked Anthony Romero, who is the ACLU's executive director, are you a racial justice organization or are you a free speech organization? And his answer was yes. And that's exactly right. You know, it makes me think of a famous line that Barack Obama often said, but it originated with Martin Luther King, apparently, which is it's not either or, it's both and. And we have had that multifaceted commitment from the beginning. I think it's impossible for the ACLU to publicize everything that we're doing. And it's impossible even for somebody like you who's well informed or me to be aware of every single thing the ACLU is doing. So I welcome this debate in the sense that it is giving us an opportunity to spotlight everything we are doing in both arenas. So for the Ellie Misdals of the world, we can say, look at everything we are doing on racial justice. Don't get hung up on the fact that some of our free speech battles, the immediate beneficiaries are members of the far right or white supremacists. And conversely, to people who think we're not doing enough about free speech, this is an opportunity. We did in 2017 exactly what we were so pilloried for doing in 1977, and yet now people look back upon it as the supposedly old glory days. That was the Skokie case when we defended free speech for neo-Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, a town that had many Holocaust survivors. Samantha, I'm just going to make one semantic point, which is we did not defend the Nazis. You didn't say that, but you said we defended the right-wing Unite the Right demonstrators. That I understand why you put it that way, but I really have to clarify. We never defend them as people. We never defend their messages. We defend an underlying principle, which in that particular case immediately redounded to their benefit. But in other cases, including the D. Ray McKesson case, is redounding to the benefit of people with exactly the opposite anti-racist agenda. And that underlying point, principle, which the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of freedom of speech in this country, and it's a bedrock principle of equality, is that government has to be neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the content, the message, the idea of speech. It can never prefer certain ideas or speakers or disfavor other ideas of or speakers just based on what they say. Only when the speech presents an imminent danger of serious harm should the government step in. And the tragedy in Charlottesville was that at the time that the case was being argued, the ACLU defending the free speech permit had already been granted to the Unite the Right demonstrators. The police chief in town said there is absolutely no evidence that there is going to be any violence at all, no evidence of any conspiracy or plots for violence. And moreover, we are prepared. If there is violence, we will be prepared to protect people against it. The tragedy is that that all turned out to be wrong. A very detailed report was done afterwards, nonpartisan, commissioned by the Charlottesville City Council, which very strongly condemned law enforcement at every level, from the university on through the FBI, for failure of planning, of coordination, of communication. And I want to make one other point, Samantha, which is that Susan Bro, whose name may not be a household word, but it should be. She is such a hero, such a champion, despite enormous personal tragedy. She is the mother of Heather Heyer, who was brutally murdered by one of the Unite the Right demonstrators. I called it Unite the White. That's a Freudian slip. Demonstrators, and no laughing matter. Many others were injured. And I was on a panel with Susan Bro a couple of years ago where the journalist asked her, well, do you think that it was wrong for the judge to have granted the parade permit to the Unite the Right? And would you think that it would be correct moving forward to deny them a parade permit in the future? And so eloquently and spontaneously and forcefully, she said it was absolutely correct to give them the right to speak. It would be absolutely wrong to deny them that right. If they have those ideas, we want to know about it so we can answer them. And if we give government the power to discriminate against their ideas, it can be used to discriminate against our ideas. And she said it much more eloquently, obviously, given who she is. There's special force to her recognition that the anti-racism cause for which her daughter died profoundly depends on free speech, even for Unite the Right demonstrators.
You just brought up an interesting point. It actually ties into your book itself that I want to talk about a little bit. Is you just said, like, if people have these ideas that we saw back in Charlottesville, it's better to know about them. Like, we want to know about them. So does that kind of just go to the essence of what your book is about, or rather having those ideas out there to know about them rather than to censor them?
That's really true, Samantha. The main title of my book is Hate, and then the subtitle is Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So as the title well conveys, my overall goal is to combat hatred and stereotyping and discrimination of all sorts. And I am absolutely convinced, based on evidence from other countries that do allow much more speech suppression than the United States does, based on prior history in the United States when we had much less robust protection for free speech, that no matter how well intended the censorship might be, including of racist speech, it ultimately does more harm than good, specifically to the causes of equality, dignity, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony.
That is so interesting. I feel like I've learned so much throughout this, 15 minutes that we've been talking. Really just breaking down this New York Times article as well as what the ACLU is all about. So Nadine Strossen, I so appreciate you coming on to talk about this. And I hope you'll join me again in the future for an interview. Like I said, thank you so much for joining me.
I would love to do it. I really appreciate your excellent questions and background research. Thank you, Samantha.